Good evening, students, faculty, colleagues, and members of our community. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of the School of Research at Sciences Po. It's my great honor to open our academic year with Professor Joseph Stiglitz. It's not every day that we begin a year in the company of a thinker whose work has transformed both scholarship and public life. Professor Stiglitz is one of the most influential economists of our time, a Nobel laureate in economics, and a recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal. He has served as chief economist of the World Bank, chair of the US Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, and is currently university professor at Columbia, co-chair of the OECD High-Level Expert Group on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, and chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He was named by the Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential individuals in the world. His contributions to economics, from his pioneering work on information asymmetries to his critiques of austerity and unregulated globalizations, have shaped both scholarship and policy debates around the world. But beyond these titles, what makes Professor Stiglitz's work so resonant for us is his conviction that economics must serve society. His research has consistently challenged orthodoxies, confronted inequality, and given voice to those often excluded from dominant narratives. It has shown us that freedom, justice, and equality are not abstract ideals, but conditions that must be actively defended against exploitation and concentrated power. His books have reached audiences far beyond academia, shaping public and policy debates. In Globalization and Its Discontent, he gave voice to those silenced by the promises of neoliberal globalization, exposing the ways international institutions deepen inequality. In The Price of Inequality, he showed how concentration of wealth undermines not only our economies, but also our democracies. And in People, Power, and Profits, Professor Stiglitz made the case for a progressive capitalism that trains in corporate power and restores the balance between markets and democracy. Each of these works, and many others, demonstrates that economics cannot only be reduced to abstract models. It's about the organization of society, about power, justice, and freedom. Tonight, he will share with us his latest book, The Road to Freedom: Economics and the Good Society. In it, he challenges the powerful narrative that unfettered markets are the guardians of liberty, showing instead that true freedom requires solidarity, institutions, and commitment to the common good. It's a book, like the best research, refuses resignation and dares to imagine alternatives. Few scholars embody so fully what hope research can be: rigorous in its methods, critical in its questioning, and engaged with the world's most urgent struggles. At the School of Research, we believe that research must rise against the wind. It must resist forgetfulness, tell the stories that power seeks to silence, and bring disciplines together to imagine different futures. This is why we bring economists into dialogue with historians, sociologists, with lawyers, and political scientists. Professor Stiglitz's work speaks directly to this mission. It demonstrates how research can uncover hidden structures of domination and open path towards emancipation. We would not imagine a more fitting way to begin our year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stiglitz to this lecture.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Sciences Po again. Partly as a refuge from Donald Trump. We all have to have a plan B as things are getting worse and worse. And that actually fits in with the topic that I'm going to discuss, and that is freedom, and my book, The Road to Freedom. Discussions of freedom, liberty, and the rule of law, and the relationship to the economic system have moved up front and center with a whole series of events, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just a few years before, in 2020, many on the right resisted masks and wearing masks and vaccination requirements as an infringement on their liberty. In the United States, there's been a growth in libertarianism. People like Elon Musk, who get billions from the US government, claiming that there shouldn't be any government. It's a little bit mystery, but intellectual consistency is not something you would expect of somebody like him. There's more recently, and especially in the last few months since January 20th, we've had Donald Trump trampling on the rule of law, both domestically and internationally, and trampling on human rights. You might say it's a strange topic for economists to be engaged in. Why don't we stick to our knitting, as the American expression has it, and just talk about economics. But actually, economists have long been engaged in debates about freedom and its relationship to the economic system. John Stuart Mill wrote a famous book in the early part of the 19th century called On Liberty. And in the middle of the last century, Milton Friedman wrote a series of books, Free to Choose with his wife, and Capitalism and Freedom. And then some of you may have noted that the title of my book is a riff off of Friedrich Hayek's book. He wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. And maybe I'll give away the plot of my book. Hayek wrote his book in 1944, and it was after the Keynesian Revolution. The Great Depression had led 1 out of 4 people to be unemployed, and Keynes had said that appropriate government intervention would enable the economy to remain at full employment. You didn't have to just accept that high level of unemployment and all the consequences to a society when 1 out of 4 people have no job. And Hayek was worried about the growth of government that was the result of that kind of intervention to maintain the economy at full employment. You might say, the alternative was, you might not like government intervention, but the alternative of not having the government intervene should have been viewed as even worse, but that wasn't Hayek's view. And he was also very concerned about the growth of the welfare state. It had already begun in Scandinavia, but he was then teaching in LSE, and in the UK, there was a strong move underfoot to create the National Health Service. So Hayek thought that these strong government actions were leading our society to the road to serfdom, to totalitarianism. One of the theses of this book, of my book, is that he was 180 degrees wrong. That you don't see authoritarian populism in countries, so much in countries where government does too much, as you do in countries like the United States, where the government does too little. And there are many reasons for this, and maybe at the end we can talk about that. But the claim of Hayek and Friedman was that free markets and free enterprises were the best way to promote economic well-being and individual freedom. And they accompanied that with a claim that there were moral justifications behind market-driven distributions and the inequalities that we observed. It was sometimes called the theory of just desserts. And they further argued that economic freedom was essential for maintaining political freedom. Each of these claims, I would argue, is suspect. Terms, let me begin by saying, language matters, and we use language, it's important to influence other people. And terms like free markets and free enterprise, which most of you probably have just grown up with accepting, is actually language that is used deliberately to bias the discussion. You could use words like private enterprise rather than free enterprise. But they use the word free enterprise because who could be against freedom? And it was really an attempt to use language to bias your view of what was going on. Neoliberalism, which was the dominant, has been the dominant economic doctrine for the last 40 years or so, is actually about freedom in a sense. Liberalism is the English word, is about freedom. And neo meant new. But it was really not new. There was nothing new in it. It was really 19th century liberalism. But it's embarrassing in the 20th century to say that I'm talking about what was true, what ideas that were put forward in the 19th century and discredited in the 19th century. You can't say, well, I'm going to just revive them. So you have to say neo-liberalism. So I would argue that the advances in economic theory and the experiences with neoliberalism over the past 40 years have exposed the limitations in these earlier analyses and suggest an alternative framework that does better to enhance individual freedom, political freedom, and societal well-being. And the motivation for writing my book was that progressives should reclaim the freedom agenda. Now, I wrote the book before the election, and I wrote the book in the hope that might, as an academic, might have changed the outcome a little bit, and we knew it was going to be we thought it was going to be close, and so any little bit to help to move the dial in the right direction was important. I don't think we knew then how important it would be. We didn't really fully appreciate how bad Donald Trump would be. Now, maybe I should say that in the atmosphere of in the United States right now, there is actually a fear of somebody in the United States talking the way I just talked. We are at risk of losing our academic freedom. My colleagues would be afraid, especially colleagues with green cards who are not U.S. citizens, because they would be afraid of being deported. And there is even fear in the university of being hauled up before a university board and saying, are you using politics, introducing politics into academic discourse? But we are supposed to be discussing the most important issues of the day. And how can we not talk about what is going on? And, if I were a little bit more polite, I would not mention the word Trump. I would say the administration or, the president. And there's no personal, well, maybe there is, but there's no personal, thing here. It's just, but there is at this moment a fear in the United States that is very palpable. Well, I should say that the freedom agenda did enter the campaign of Kamala Harris a little bit. Some of you may know that Beyonce's song on freedom was became her campaign song for a while. But you all know it wasn't enough to turn the tide, and Donald Trump actually won a majority of votes, unlike in 2020, where he still claims he won, even though he lost by 7 million votes. And just to give you a feeling of anxiety as you enter the world, if he could lose the election by 7 million votes and still claim he won, and 70% of the Republicans today believe he won, you can imagine why there should be some anxiety about what will happen in 2026 and 2028. So that's all background for what I'm going to be talking about. What I want to do, there's a lot I want to go through here. I won't be able to go through all of it. But I want to begin by first talking somewhat abstractly about the meaning of freedom and liberty, some basic concepts. When you take an important subject like freedom and give it to an economist to think about, they're going to make it a little bit boring and mundane. And so I'm going to begin talking about trade-offs. But I'm going to then go to introduce a kind of conundrum, how coercion can sometimes enhance freedom. I'll talk a little bit then, if I have time, about the desirability in a free society of progressive taxation, provide a critique of the moral and fishy arguments of Hayek and Friedman, talk about social cohesion and the internalization of externalities, and the importance of a democratic media. And then the second part of the talk, I wanted to address the question is what kind of an economic and political system actually does deliver on freedom. So let me begin with a broad economic perspective, and that is when economists talk about basically what freedom, a natural way to think about it is your opportunity set, what you can do. And if you have a larger opportunity set, in some sense you have more freedom. To put it another way, if somebody at a point of starvation doesn't really have freedom, he does what he has to do in order to survive. And then if you expand what they can do in a meaningful sense, then you're expanding their freedom. A lot of the earlier discussions on government intrusion on freedom focused on, you might say, a negative freedoms, that your opportunity set was being restricted by certain things that the government was doing. But I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the positive side. That is to say, what government does to expand what individuals' opportunity sets are. From the perspective of an economist, the language surrounding this a loss of freedom doesn't make that much difference. All that matters is the set of available options from which the individual can choose. Whether you describe it as an incentive or describe it in regulation as a fine doesn't really change the reality. There's a caveat to this, which is behavioral economics has emphasized that how you express things or how you articulate them actually can make a difference. There's some students here who took my course in behavioral economics at Columbia, and they know I'm summarizing what we spent a whole semester talking about. So for any society to function, there has to be regulation. There has to be some forms of collective action. And that's why the extremes of libertarianism aren't very useful, saying we're just going to get rid of government. You can't function in a society can't function. And if we think about this from a broad, very historical perspective, the Ten Commandments were a simple set of regulations, but in a modern, urban knowledge-based economy, you need many more regulations. And you know, we know what happens if you don't have adequate regulations, like you had the financial meltdown in 2008. You know, without a set of regulations and laws, society just can't, a modern society simply can't function. Now, the central idea I want to focus on here are, the first idea I want to focus on is that there are not, in this area, absolutes. One person's freedom is often another person's unfreedom. There was a famous Oxford philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who put it much more eloquently than economists would put it. He said freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. So by giving more freedom to the wolves, the sheep didn't like it very much. And economists refer to these as externalities, and they are pervasive and they're ubiquitous. And there are both a positive and negative externality. Now, in the United States, we become very sensitive about these trade-offs. Every day, there's a mass murder in the United States, literally. And why is that? Well, people have the right to carry a gun. Not only a gun, an AK-47. An AK-47 are very efficient if you want to kill people. You can spray them very quickly with bullets. And on the right, they say it's a fundamental right of all individuals to be able to carry an AK-47 at all times, everywhere. But that right to have those AK-47 everywhere means that a lot of other people are going to lose their right to live. And so we have to balance those two rights, those two freedoms. Which is more important, the freedom to carry an AK-47 or the freedom to live? Well, I thought that was a rhetorical question, but in the United States, it's not a rhetorical question. There are significant numbers of people who would say it's more important to carry an the right to carry an AK-47 is more important than other people's right to live. The same issue was the one I mentioned in the very beginning, the right not to get vaccinated or wear a face mask was a big issue in COVID, during COVID. But that right threatens other people's right, their right not to get the disease, right not to be hospitalized, not to die. And so again, society has to make a judgment. And I think the judgment that was made by most societies was the right one. And another big regulation, Trump believes that every coal company has the right to pollute, and we know pollution is going to mean people are going to die, and the world will suffer from climate change. But their view is that the right to pollute is more important than the right to live or the right to be free from climate change. So the point of these trade-offs is that in each of these cases, society has to make judgments, but I think most reasonable societies, I'm not sure I belong to one, but most reasonable societies, there would be an agreement about those trade-offs and where we would land. But there are many instances where the resolution of trade-offs is more difficult, and that's where you need a complex societal dialogue, and we can talk about, if we have time, that. There's these kinds of trade-offs are pervasive. For instance, are at the core of issues of distribution of income. Conservatives argue that taxation is a deprivation of liberty, of the right to spend one's money as one pleases. Taxation is coercion, even when there is some form of representation. But in that sense, in the sense I defined freedom, taxation constricts the individual's budget constraining what she can do, her opportunity set. But at the same time, redistributive taxes and expenditure policies expand the opportunity set of others. And so we have to make judgments about these kinds of trade-offs. And there are, I think, in many cases, clear societal judgments which would suggest that expanding the opportunities by providing health and education to the poor, the value of expanding their opportunity sets in that way is far more important than, say, the constriction of the opportunity set of the multi-billionaires by the imposition of a wealth tax, of a minimum wealth tax of 2%, which has been part of the debate here in France. I think most reasonable societies would say, yeah, there are trade-offs, but this is the way we ought to come down on them. There are also some important externalities associated with inequality. It undermines economic performance, as I argued in one of my books. I now want to put forward a further argument that some coercion can be freeing for everyone. And that sounds a little bit paradoxical, coercion being freeing, but the best illustration of that is traffic lights. In a crowded city like New York, Paris, think about a world with and without traffic lights. Traffic lights are a regulation. They say they're a restraint. They are a form of coercion. They say that you cannot go until you get a green light. But if you didn't have traffic lights, you couldn't go anyway. You'd have gridlock. So having a simple regulation that says you have to take turns, which is what you tell little children. You have to take turns, and it's a simple regulation. We don't think usually of traffic lights as a regulation, but it is a regulation, and it enables all of us to move. So it expands everybody's freedom. So that's an example of a little bit of coercion expanding everybody's freedom. But that's a metaphor for lots of other things. So let me give you another example. In 2020, we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and you couldn't go out of your home without being worried about getting the disease, and the world shut down. What liberated us from that? Well, what really liberated us to a large extent was the COVID-19 vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. Well, getting that vaccine was not costless. That vaccine was developed very quickly because we had already done research on the mRNA platform. That research required resources. It was done at universities. It involved science, which is now viewed by Trump as an evil subject. But at the time, they thought, maybe vaccines were good. But what does that mean? We had to pay for it. How do we pay for it? By taxes. Where do people pay taxes voluntarily? Not really. So it required coercion. So the coercion of taxes enabled us to have a vaccine that allowed us to go about our lives. So that little bit of coercion actually freed us. It freed us enormously. And so that's the general point, that coercion can enhance freedom. And sometimes, this is what economists call a coordination problem. Sometimes coordination involves very little or no sustained coordination, and yet can give enormous benefits, like driving on the right or left side of the road. If you go to some countries, you know that they haven't yet had enough coercion to make everybody decide which side to go on. And let me tell you, it isn't very relaxing to drive in a city, in a place where people haven't decided whether you're supposed to drive on the left or the right. But most countries today have decided either to be on the left or the right. Doesn't matter which one. You can have a well-functioning society either way. Most of the world does it on the left, but the UK manages on the right. Once the rules are set, they're easy to sustain. So these issues of trade-offs are pervasive and involve, every aspect of our society. One example of this is exploitation. As I mentioned before, Milton Friedman wrote this book with his wife, Rose, called Free to Choose. And I thought a better title for his book would have been Free to Exploit. Because what he wanted in that book is to strip away regulations and to downplay the role of government. If we don't have regulations, some individuals will exploit others, either through market power, through exploiting vulnerabilities, irrationalities, asymmetries of information. And economics over the last 40, 50 years has explained a whole wide range of ways in which this kind of exploitation can exist and can be persistent. And what can be done about it? The exploitation is of the many forms. Is a exploitation of market power, exploitation of the environment, exploitation of those who have less information. I want to now turn to a somewhat different aspect of the subject, mentioned very briefly by Mill, hasn't gotten a lot of attention in more recent discussions, but it is based on behavioral economics. Modern behavioral economics explains that behavior may be more effectively affected by changing beliefs, perceptions, and preferences than by changing constraints. An obvious example is you don't want litter. Litter gives rise to externalities. So the question is, how do you do it? Well, one way to do it is incentives. You penalize somebody if they're caught littering. But there's another way, which is what most of us do with our children. We try to tell them it's really antisocial to litter. And we say it enough that they actually incorporate it as part of their identity, of who they are. They're not the kind of person who will, after they eat a candy bar, throw the wrapper on the street. Well, that's an important dimension of how society functions, how it regulates itself. And it's non-coercive in a way. This kind of socialization is one way of thinking about it. It induces individuals to internalize the externalities. And to the extent that a social order succeeds in doing this, there may be less need for seemingly more coercive public interventions to regulate externalities. There's still one more aspect of the broad discussion of freedom I want to talk about, and that is the role of the media and economic and political power. Once one recognizes that beliefs, perceptions matter, and that they are alterable, you're not born with your beliefs or with your perceptions, then it becomes really important to think about who gets to control the space in which these get shaped. And that's really part of the big debate that is actually going on in a very crude way in the United States. If perceptions, beliefs, and preferences can be altered by the media, then society faces an important set of decisions. Who gets to control the press and gets to control or at least shape societal meta-narratives with the consequent loss of effective freedom on the part of others? And in most countries, it's based simply on wealth. And that enables the wealthy to advance through economics and politics their interest, further constraining the freedom choices of others. And that raises the broader question of what regulations should be imposed on the media, including the social media, to prevent or at least reduce these social harms. This is going to be, Europe has already made some decisions about that through the passage of the DSA, the Digital Service Act. And the EU trade negotiator did a deal with the United States, which I thought was a really bad deal, but there was some coercion having to do with military support for Ukraine. But any agreement with Trump is not worth the paper that it's written on. And no sooner had that agreement been finished when, about 10 days later, Trump says, you have to get rid of your Digital Marketing Act, your Digital Service Act, your other regulations. I was on a panel with the EU trade negotiator who was fairly proud of what she had done, she thought, and she said, we'll never give up the DSA. And other EU officials said the same thing. If that's true, of course, it means that you don't have a trade deal with the United States. You're back to the drawing board, and there will be new tariffs. This is a little bit of a side point, but it is an illustration of what happens when you don't have the rule of law, international law. It's capricious, you don't know where you're going, and it's clearly an intrusion by the United States on your sovereignty. The general point is, in each of the cases, there are trade-offs, there are no absolutes, but I suspect that constructing the good society would entail more regulations and less ability of the wealthy to dominate the shaping of beliefs and preferences, and I think a good society would have some laws, like the DSA, which the United States doesn't have, and just like a good society would have laws that would prevent the loser in an election from trying to overturn the election, as Trump did and as Bolsonaro did in Brazil. But the United States says, Trump says, no, you should have the right to try to overturn those elections. The final concept I want to talk about very briefly is one which actually was one of the motivation, was central to to John Stuart Mill's work, and it was about tolerance. And it's an idea that we now is really critical. It's the idea that one person's views, beliefs about what is desirable or good should have no bearing on what is allowed, encouraged, or discouraged. Only actions should matter, and only actions that directly adversely affect others, not actions that others might disapprove of. And my concern is that the right, at least in the United States, has repudiated such notions of Enlightenment tolerance as they walked away from other Enlightenment values, like science, as I already mentioned. So this is the first part of the talk, and it's trying to lay out some general ideas about what we mean by freedom, how do we think about it. I now want to talk about what kind of society delivers on this. And I'm going to go a little bit faster. Any of you know my own work know the first part of what I'm going to be saying, which is that neoliberal capitalism doesn't deliver, in spite of the name about neoliberal. It doesn't. Unfettered markets are not competitive, they're not efficient, they're not stable. Maximizing shareholder value does not maximize societal well-being. Hayek and Friedman underestimated, ignored a host of market failures, and their model of the individual was flawed. They believed that people had fixed preferences, were rational and infinitely selfish. I think they may have been, but that doesn't mean all other individuals are infinitely selfish. And they assumed everybody was well informed, and it's obvious that they are not so formed. Friedman's view was much more of an equilibrium theory, and most of modern economics is based on that kind of equilibrium theory, and that's the body of work that's been most thoroughly examined and shown to be wrong. The Arrow and DeBrew proved a set of conditions under which competitive markets are efficient, with lots of assumptions like no externalities, perfect information, and so restrictive as not to be relevant. It was really interesting from an intellectual point of view. Friedman, who really never understood the Arrow-DeBrew theorem, used the Arrow-DeBrew theorem as the justification for why free markets worked. Arrow, who had actually proved the theorem, never believed it. He knew that the assumptions that he had made in order to prove it were just unrealistic and irrelevant for the economy. So after he did this crowning achievement, intellectual achievement, Adam Smith had talked about the invisible hand and how pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. The work of Arrow and DeBrew were really, took 170 years to prove that assertion, the conditions under which it was true. So it was really an intellectual achievement. But after he did that, Ken Arrow recognized that it didn't describe our economy. And he spent his time talking about imperfect information, healthcare, discrimination, education, all the things that were going wrong. And Milton Friedman was an ideologue. And he didn't look at those assumptions. He just said, oh, they proved that the economy is efficient. Hayek was a little bit more subtle. He had a more evolutionary theory, and economists have not devoted as much attention to analyzing the behavior of evolutionary systems. But there's been a little work, including some by me, which has shown that evolution doesn't have a teleology. In general, the evolutionary processes are not efficient. So for Hayek, it was just an assertion, evolution is efficient. It was sort of Darwinian, selection process. But Darwin also did not prove that the outcome of that. In fact, it was quite the opposite. If you look up what happened in the Galapagos, you understand that there were multiple equilibrium that emerged out of those evolutionary processes. So there was no efficiency properties associated with evolution. What I argue in the book is, in fact, that neoliberal capitalism may not even be a sustainable institutional arrangement, either environmentally, socially, politically, or economically, because on its own, without governmental oversight, competition won't be sustained, and we see that now what's happening with the tech giants in the United States. The economic divides that it gives rise to make it politically unsustainable. The divides it gives rise weaken trust, and without trust, a market economy can't function. It encourages individual traits, which also undermine trust, and thus undermine economic sustainability. So I try to argue in the book is that neoliberal capitalism is a system that may devour itself. So that brings us to the question of what kind of society or what kind of an economy is most likely to enhance the freedoms of most citizens and be sustainable. It's, to me, very clear that the 40-year experiment with neoliberalism has led to lower growth, more inequality, and now, at least in the United States, the disillusionment has led to growth of authoritarian populism and is setting the United States on the road to fascism. Now, there's a concept, what I try to describe in the book is an alternative framework. I have to admit, I never figured out a good name for it. And so I call it progressive capitalism. If I were in Europe, I probably would call it rejuvenated social democracy. But capitalism is not at the core. Markets are part of it. But let me try to describe what it is and give a reward for anybody who comes up with a better name. But it's also, I called it this partly for an American audience because we like the term progressive, language matters, and Americans like capitalism, the name capitalism. So if you want to sell some new system, it has to be a variant of capitalism. So that's, I put those two together and that's what I call it, but I'm not wedded to it. So the basic idea is that there are alternative ways of organizing society that do a better job of enhancing freedom. And there are several characteristics. It entails a better balance of the market and state, or more broadly, collective and private action. It entails a rich ecology of institutions, including cooperatives and not-for-profits, arrangements with government providing a public option, a variety of forms of collective action like unions, civil society, class action suits. The most successful U.S. institutions were, at least before they were attacked by Trump, are not-for-profit universities and research institutions, Harvard, Columbia, Yale. These are all not-for-profit They're not government. They're a kind of other form of institutional arrangement. And we often dichotomize the world into for-profit and government, but these have been a very successful set of institutions. And when you think about education, at least in the United States, emblematic of a for-profit university is Trump University. Most of you are too young to remember Trump University. It was a university that Donald Trump set up basically to fleece people who wanted to get ahead and didn't know better. And he made millions off of it. And finally, before he became president, he was sued, and he had to pay millions of dollars of fines for these for dishonesty in advertising, basically. He was exploiting others' aspirations to get ahead and taking advantage of it. And that's, I don't want to say all for-profit universities are that way, but there, at least in the United States, there are a lot of them. And I should, when I was on the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we wanted to have a regulation that would say, disclose what your graduation rate is, disclose what your success in getting jobs for your students. And they said that's an intrusion on our freedom. A fundamental right is for us to be able to exploit young people who don't know any better. That's a fundamental freedom in our society. Well, they won. Interestingly, just a little bit of a digression, eventually, after the Iraq War, as the Iraq and Afghanistan War, they targeted veterans, people leaving serving the United States in the military. These for-profit universities targeted these vulnerable young men, mostly, and took advantage of them. And it was so outrageous that finally legislation was passed that you could not do that for veterans. So you ask the question, people were so outraged that they were exploiting veterans, but they said, anybody who's not a veteran, you can exploit. You say, how can a society make those kinds of decisions? Well, the kind of framework that I argue for here, I think will deliver both greater efficiency and greater equity, more freedom to choose. It will actually ensure more competition, provide social insurance, better risk management, enables more risk-taking and more innovation. A critical subject that the importance of which I think we're only beginning to grasp now with Donald Trump is the importance of checks and balances. Now, when I was young, we were taught how wonderful our Constitution was. We didn't spend much time on how every slave couldn't vote, but his owner was given 3/5 of a vote. And that the American fight for freedom was freedom from the UK, but not freedom for the slaves, for the enslaved. So we got a very, again, distorted view of what our Constitution was about. But one part of the Constitution that was strongly talked about was our systems of checks and balances. But it was a system of checks and balances within government, but not within society. And I think what we now know is that if you have excessive concentrations of economic power, wealth, that will get translated in one way or another into concentrations of political power. And you could not have gotten a more graphic picture of that than the picture of Donald Trump with all the oligarchs, the tech oligarchs, around him in Inauguration Day, paying their respect, but also asking for their due. So one of the interesting ideas is that there may be multiple societal equilibrium, an egalitarian equilibrium and one marked with large societal divides. And a critical and difficult question is how one moves out of the latter towards the former and how one prevents slipping from the good equilibrium into the bad. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about one aspect of our system of checks and balances that has moved to the fore, and that is academic freedom. And I want to talk about it because at some level, I feel like I'm talking about a self-interested position here. Obviously, we want to be able to do whatever we want to do. So it sounds like it's in our self-interest. But I want to argue that academic and press freedom are an essential part of society's systems of checks and balances. And that is why authoritarian figures like Trump work so hard to undermine both. So academic freedom is important in the sense that society has created us as part of its control system. It's created a set of institutions with individuals devoted to analyzing how and how well the system is performing and how to design reforms that might enable it to work better. You know, we talk a lot about the freedom of the press, and I think that is absolutely essential. But the press has to have resources to investigate. They have to report. To know what to report, somebody has to do the research that they're reporting on. And that's why investigative reporting is so important. But many of the things are not about of the nature of investigative reporting, but of the nature of how does our society function? Does the corporate income tax actually lead to less investment or more investment? Is the big, beautiful bill that was passed regressive or progressive? Who bears the benefits and costs? And reporters can't do that. But we have to have some way for our society to understand what is going on. And that's what academia does. And we have to have the ability to do it independently. Obviously, if the government proposes X and we say X is bad, the government's not going to like that. So we know that we are going to make some people unhappy. That's part of our job. You know, not only making you unhappy as students, but also making the government unhappy. That is part of our job description. So you need to have individuals able to freely criticize both both the system and those who are running it. And those criticisms and ideas have to be widely disseminated. True press freedom can't exist if the media is captured by an oligarchy, echoing what I said earlier. And these are all ideas associated with the Enlightenment. And I want to spend just a minute here talking about why science is so important and why the attack on academic freedom and science going on in the United States is so bad, not only for the United States, but for the world. And I want to put it in the language of economists. Why is it that we have a higher standards of living today than 250 years ago and longer life expectancy? And the argument that I put forward in another recent book is that the transformation to learning societies, the change in mindset associated with the Enlightenment that occurred around 1800 for Western economies, more recently for those in Asia, has had a far, far greater impact on human well-being than improvements in allocative efficiency or resource accumulation. The point I want to raise here is, again, economists traditionally have talked about efficiency of resource allocation and capital accumulation. But far more important than that was the change in mindset and how people thought about the world. In particular, a set of ideas, I call it the Enlightenment values, questioning authority, recognizing that our understanding of the world could increase and change was possible. It was a belief in progress. Reacquiring and reassessment of how we know the truth and how we organize society. Development of the scientific method and rethinking social organization and coming up with ideas like the rule of law and new institutions with new norms. And just to show you what I mean, the drama of this, is these are charts showing GDP. I don't want to be crucified on this. Data is not very good going back 1,000 years. So, but this is the best data that one has, and a number of people have done similar results. And I'll show you what you see in that chart is basically total stagnation for centuries until the time of the Enlightenment, beginning of about 1800. And one way of checking the accuracy of that is looking at the real wages of London craftsmen. As you may know, the English liked to collect data, and they collect data on the wages, nominal wages, and on the price of food. And so you can do a calculation of real wages, and the picture looks exactly the same form, and giving us a little bit more confidence that that data in the previous chart was actually accurate. The next chart shows the enormous increase in life expectancy since 1820. So the point I want to make is that the change in mindset that was associated with the Enlightenment was really at the root of our extended living standards and life expectancy, and that was based on science, and that is now being attacked in the United States. So I just say how fundamental what is going on is. I want to mention that the change in mindset was also associated with the creation of liberal democracies. At the same time, we've recognized, say in China, that undemocratic governments have succeeded in closing the knowledge gap. The question is, can they do this on a sustained basis? Can they be knowledge leaders? Also, success has been typically associated with significant cross-border flows, not just of ideas, but of people. But liberal democracy with good institutions are not enough. Underlying their creation and their sustainability must lie individuals committed to them, with underlying beliefs and norms. And that's what, so most of you may know that the Nobel Prize was in economics science, Nobel Prize in economics was given this year to a set of scholars who've done really important work emphasizing good institutions and the role good institutions have in economic performance. But it's hard to tell what is a good institution, and what might seem like a good institution may not be a good institution, And most importantly, good institutions have to be sustainable. And we thought we had good democratic institutions in the United States, but we are not sure that they're sustainable. And what makes the institutions sustainable is not the institutions themselves, but the underlying beliefs and norms in society. And that won't be sustained unless the system is delivering for most people in society. So to me, one of the reasons for the failures in the United States is that our economic system did not deliver for very significant portions of the population. Another reason that the system is not working, I think, is the way it has been shaping individuals. The current economic system shapes individuals to be greedy, selfish, limited concern for others, less empathy, and less honest than we might like. Other economic systems might shape people differently. For instance, cooperatives may help shape individuals to be more cooperative, other regarding enhanced social cohesion. And with such other regarding behavior and greater social cohesion, as I mentioned earlier, the need for more obtrusive forms of coercion to deal with negative externalities is reduced. And this is the subject of a forthcoming book of mine with Carla Hoff and Alison DeMera called The Other Invisible Hand. Since this is a occasion where your inaugural lecture for the year, I wanted to mention the centrality of liberal education and democratic media. Education and a better understanding of the way our preferences are shaped and our actions are affected by peer pressure can be freeing in a basic sense, and it's, in fact, one of the purposes of a liberal arts education. Similarly, more democratic media frees us from having our beliefs shaped by and for the interest of the wealthy. So let me just finally conclude. It's basically what I tried in the first part of my talk is to outline a broad sense of what we mean by freedom, why freedom is important. It's a particular vocabulary. You can think about it other ways, other vocabularies like expanding opportunity sets. I try to explain why I think neoliberal capitalism has failed in every dimension. That is, they not only deliver freedom for most individuals, or for many, a large fraction, but also in efficiency, equity, stability. And what I want to argue is that there are alternative ways of organizing our society that can actually deliver more freedom and do a better job of creating what I would call a good society and setting us more firmly on the road to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich and inspiring lecture. I know many of you must have questions and comments, and maybe let me open the floor with a small question myself, and then don't hesitate to find the mics here and ask questions if you want. Maybe one question just to riff off of your conclusion, in a way for us to guarantee that somehow these alternatives of the way we think and increasing freedoms and assuring a road to freedom, we need the guarantors of something to make sure that this happens. So if we're looking at governments that are today with the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, who will guarantee that these somehow institutions can function and the common good that you talk about can actually be put in practice? So it's sort of the question that you asked me earlier. So to what extent can we make sure that there will be good laws written and that these good laws will actually be enforced in a society where we are a bit confused about who's going to actually be putting them in place?
Yeah, so let me say, I think the two parts of the answer. First, as I said, one cannot feel confident that you'll be able to do that if you don't have good systems of checks and balances, if you have concentrations of power either within government or within society more generally. Because, it's like that famous, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That if you have too much power, they'll use it. And it's just too difficult to restrain oneself. So the first is to design institutions that have institutional structure with these checks and balances. I want to emphasize, go back to the Enlightenment, why I am so fixated on the Enlightenment as a key moment in history. Because the Enlightenment was where we said we can design institutional organizations. So that's the question. How do we design our arrangement, our institutions that have these checks and balances? And that's been a very old question. I think it was Cicero or Seneca where they asked the question, who guards the guardians? The question is, you have oversight, but who oversees the oversight? Well, when you have diffuse economic power, you can have everybody checking everybody else and in a way that may not be that obtrusive. So in systems of peer monitoring, we're all used to thinking of work organization being hierarchical. But there are certain advantages of hierarchical production systems, but you can also have peer monitoring. You have cooperatives where A monitors B, B monitors C, C monitors A. So you don't have a top-down, you can have everybody monitoring everybody else. You can formalize these systems of decentralized cooperative behavior. So that's the first point of making sure that there's not concentration of power, and the real failure of what has been exposed in the United States is that evidently there are not enough checks on the president. And I don't think the Supreme Court has been thinking about these issues from a very philosophical point of view. I mean, the Republican members of those are not very philosophical, I think, in a certain way. By philosophical, I mean, when you make a decision asking the question, if this is the way our government is going to operate, what would it mean for the operation? If you gave that much power to the president, even if you think Donald Trump is a good president, what would happen if another president that you didn't think was such a good president? If you give anybody that much power, it can be abused. So, to me, a critical part of this is that kind of thinking about how a system would work if there were somebody who wasn't very good in a particular position. The second point I want to make is that I made it already a little, that to sustain our institutions requires belief in those institutions. The obvious question is, why aren't more Americans upset when the courts say you don't have the power to shut down U.S. foreign aid? Congress is given the power to appropriate. The Supreme Court had previously ruled that the president cannot impound. Impound means not spend money that's been appropriated. The courts have ruled that he's violated those laws, he doesn't respond. He continues to take apart didn't restore funding. And that's true in every one of the things he's done. Courts have ruled over and over again, ruled that what he is doing is illegal. It was so clear that he did not have the authority to levy the tariffs that he's levied. Congress delegated certain powers to him, but they cannot delegate the power to tax. They cannot delegate, and they said it was an economic emergency. How is the tariff he's imposing on Brazil of 50% an economic response to an economic emergency? He's imposed the tariff on Brazil explicitly because he doesn't like the Supreme Court of Brazil putting Bolsonaro on trial for their event was January 8th, in imitation of our event of January 6th, of trying to overthrow President Lula. So he has no authority to do that. Now, he's doing it. Why isn't there more outrage? Part of the answer, I think, is that there are large parts of America who do not believe that the political and economic system has been working for them. And we haven't done as good enough job as teachers of inculcating what it means to the Enlightenment values, of trying to explain why it is that we think these are so important. The kind of graph of what it was like and why the Enlightenment values have made a difference. So we haven't done our job in education, but it's very clear that large numbers don't feel the system has delivered, and for good reason. The minimum wage in the United States is at the same level adjusted for inflation that it was about 65 years ago. Can you imagine not having a pay raise in 65 years? That's longer than your working life. And the median income of the United States has basically been stagnating for decades. So there are good reasons why, and life expectancy is in decline. And the disparity, the life expectancy in the United States, a rich country, is the lowest of any of the major advanced countries, and has the largest disparities. So to me, it's not a surprise that there's a lot of disillusionment with the system.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, there are mics here.
Should I go? Yes. So thank you very much for this incredible lecture. I wanted to ask you about the topic of the day, which in France is debt. I know you've worked on it a lot, and in your lecture today you invited us to think outside of the kind of economic standard doctrine of neoliberalism, and you mentioned a lot of important things for the well-being of our societies as liberal education. All of that costs a lot, and advanced societies don't grow anymore as much, and what they have to pay on debt is always increasing. I'm Italian, maybe you can tell from my accent. So how do we deal with that? And I ask you this because I think a lot of the conversation around debt is still wrapped in the neoliberal understanding that we talked about. So I wanted to ask your opinion on this matter. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick a couple of
Okay. Yeah.
together?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. It's always a pleasure to listen to your talk. I wanted to ask you about something you touched on at the end, which is the interesting movement. I'm sure you saw the graph of the electorate, the core electorate of the Republicans versus the Democrats. And what's very striking is that the Democrats used to be low income, low education, and then they move up, and Harris is the first candidate for which it's low, high income, high education, and especially high income. And so it means that the Harris electorate is now closer to what the Bob Dole 1996 Republican electorate was back then. And actually Trump's electorate now is almost identical to what Obama 2008 was. So there is this massive shifting of electorate, and I was wondering whether you had incentives as to insights as to why. And here I'm also referring to the work by Musa Al-Gharbi on looking at state-controlled and cities controlled by Democrats. And so what he does is is the condition of the worst off in society improving when the Democrats control the House, they have the governor, they're in a very blue state, and what he shows is not so much. So isn't there part of the responsibility lying with the Democratic Party and the fact that they didn't do enough, especially after the 2008 crisis when they had an opportunity to do deep reform and they didn't? Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. I'm a second-year master student here in the School of Research, and I'm in international relations major. And it was really interesting what you talked about the institution, especially for me. I have this question regarding this, let's say, legitimacy and sustainability of the institution that you talked about. You said good institutions are sustainable. And because they are addressing especially the large population in the world. And unlike the institution like the UN, the institution like the OECD, for example, are only the institutions with certain member states. And what I want to know is that, like, what do you think that these institutions can sustain, like, can be sustainable? Even though they have small representative countries in the world, and they don't actually address the larger populations.
Okay, sure. Okay, I can take that. Yeah, so let me begin with the last question. There are always going to be different clusterings of countries with different interests. There's one universal institution, which is the UN, but it's natural that the advanced countries will get together and say, what are our common problems? I think I wish there were another organization like the OECD for emerging markets and developing countries, and there isn't. Not that OECD is necessarily, such a good, but the idea that they would have a shared interest in trying to understand better how advanced countries operate seems to me reasonable. Where I've been concerned, this is the OECD has been entrusted with developing certain policies for the whole world. They took on responsibility for the tax reform called BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. And in doing that, the issue was the multinational corporate income tax was basically both inefficient and unfair. The revenues weren't necessarily going to where the production actually occurred. Globalization had opened up a huge a set of ways of avoiding taxation for the big corporations, putting small businesses at a disadvantage. So there are a whole set of problems with our multinational corporate income tax. And then they asked the OECD to reform it. Well, the OECD basically represented the interest of the big advanced countries. And it's not the interest of the advanced countries, it was the interest of the big companies in the big countries. And so you got an agreement that came out of that was very deficient. Part of the agreement was okay, and part of the agreement was terrible. So that's where I think I started having objections, where They go outside their cluster where their competence, and even though they said we have an inclusive framework, the Secretariat has a mindset representing advanced countries. So I think it is important for different clusters of countries to get together, and that's going to be particularly important now that the United States is trying to abuse its power. And you see this, there's something called the Shanghai Cooperative Arrangement, that's just been meeting to intention, where they brought together India, Russia, China, and a large number of other countries, and Trump has made them more cohesive because they all say we have more economic power than the United States if we act together. So rather than having rule of law, international rule of law that we were aspiring to get internationally, we were aspiring for that, never got a good rule of law, but Trump has said, I'm going to trample on any principle, any rule of law. I'm going to exercise U.S. power. Well, U.S. has significantly less than 20% of global trade, less than 20% of global GDP. So the U.S. doesn't have that much power. It doesn't control rare earths, minerals, magnets, all those things. So Trump overestimated his power. But the fact that he's behaving in such a way of a schoolyard bully is inducing other people to get together and say, we will cooperate in fighting the United States. So it's not a good situation for anybody, but obviously for the United States. On the question of the what's happened to the Democratic Party and the role it played in its own defeat, let me make just a few comments. First, I think party organizations are still important, although I'm told in the new world of social media they may become less important, but parties are important and have been the basic organization for elections. And one of the big differences between the Republican and Democratic parties was that the Republican Party paid a lot of attention to the party structure and strengthening the party at the local and state level. And Obama did not. It's one of the big critiques of Obama is that he didn't, surprisingly, because he had been an organizer, he didn't appreciate the importance of local organization. And so that, I think he overestimated a real problem with political leaders. They think they're too important and they don't realize the need for organizational structure. The second problem with the Democratic Party, as you all probably know, there's a very big split in the Democratic Party between the centrist and the progressives. And the centrists are basically very much like centrists on the right. The only difference, this is unfair, but I'll say it anyway. The only difference between the centrists on the right and the centrists on the left is that the Democrats felt the pain of the poor when they did nasty things, and the Republicans enjoyed it. So it was really not that they behaved that much differently, and that there were big differences, I know, but it was more on the pain they felt when they did things. And the Democrats would say, the centrists say, we have to live within our budget, and I'll come back to that in the answer to the next question. But they didn't have a progressive vision, so they didn't give an alternative. And Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party were trying to give a vision of a societal vision. We said we're going to limit power, we're going to give access to education, we're going to have access to medicine. We're going to change the way our society operates. And when you have a vision, and this is true of Kamala Harris, that says we're going to do the same thing that we've done for 40 years, and that's not much of a vision. You know, we're going to tweak the system. A few more people are going to get schooling. It's not a vision. And so, in my mind, that was the major failure of the Democratic Party. The other aspect of the question is really interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right. The Democratic Party has become the party of the educated. And it lost touch with the ordinary workers in the country. And they've known it. It's been a source of, I don't know, right word, angst among Democrats. To give you one example, one constituent in, as you know, American education is very expensive. And so you should appreciate what the discount you're getting relative to what you'd be paying if you went to an American university. The average American student graduates with a debt of, I think, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. And a major political issue has been debt forgiveness for students. And if you know have any friends in America, it's a big issue. Well, some of the Democratic Party leaders really feel worried about that agenda because half of Americans don't go to college. And when you're having debt forgiveness, you're giving money, in effect, to those who are at the top of the income distribution relative to the others. And so even the discussion of debt forgiveness, which is a core issue among those who've gone to college, is an anathema to those who have not gone to college. And so it's part of the split within the Democratic, how do we deal with this problem? I think part of the thing is either having income contingent student loans or government provision of education tuition. Now, on the question of debt, let me just say the broad thing, you know, to ask an economist, you obviously are going to be, an economist is going to say you have to live within your resource constraints. You know, you can't get, there's no manna from heaven here. You have to live within your resource constraints. But the question is, that isn't a full answer to the question, because if austerity, for instance, the attempt to say we have so much debt we're going to have to raise taxes isn't done well, you can actually make the economy slow down, and you have revenues will go down. And that's why I mentioned before, you know, taxing the people at the very top, the wealth tax, will not slow down the economy in a significant way and generates revenue. And so that's the kind of policy that where the macroeconomic effects are minimal, and you give you resources that you can use for other purposes, including writing down the debt. So it isn't just the existence of the debt, it's how you raise the revenue that is going to make your budget in better shape, and what kind of investments you put in. The other thing I would emphasize is that in general, I think you need to take a holistic approach where you have to look at balance sheets. So if you cut back on climate mitigation because you're worried about the debt that you are passing on to your children, but the result of that is you leave them a bigger climate debt, they're worse off. Or if you cut back on education or on research expenditure, they're worse off. So to not spend money with higher return than the interest rate that you have to pay, is impoverishing future generations. So you have to look at what the money is going for and whether in fact the return on that investment is greater than the interest rate you have to pay.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. My question is twofold. It touches upon some of the things that you've brought up around some of the ideologies that have kind of been hegemonic in our economic thoughts. So, you know, Friedman and Hayek. My question is, do you believe, or how do you believe that this has come to be, that they are just still, I think, to this day, so strongly entrenched in American values? Is it the role of freedom? Is it the way that they've been able to push? Or is it purely also the fact that they themselves were ideologues and through the Chicago School pushed through it? Like how has that become so important to economic kind of thinking in the US? And then secondly, if it is such a strong hegemonic kind of ideology, how does the left respond? You've proposed a really, I think, interesting set of ways of thinking about how we can make the economy better, but is that enough? Do we need a change in paradigm, or is small incremental changes in our way of thinking about the economy persuasive enough, especially if, like you've talked about, workers feel left behind and there is very much still this link between freedom and economy and neoliberal kind of hegemonic thinking in the US? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we take one here. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Stiglitz, thank you for your lecture today. I'm also a master's student studying international relations, but I'm also very interested in the political economic system of China. And I know you have made lots of commentary on China in the past, but given that today I have the pleasure and I have the honor to meet you here today in person, so I would still like to ask you some questions about it. So, in general, to what extent do you consider the current the current political economic system of China serve the interest of its society? And in recent years, do you think this system is moving in a better direction in achieving that goal, or is moving into a worse direction? And maybe secondly, also, it's a bit related to the first question, but maybe more specifically. So in your lecture, correct me if I'm wrong. So in your lecture, you mentioned that the check and balance is also essential to achieving the goal of making economics serve the interests of the society, right? And in China, let's maybe first put aside the question of whether it's a democracy or not. But in recent years, there are many discussions about the evolution of that system. So many China scholars, China's experts consider it's concentrating more and more its political power. And like one of our very renowned China scholars here in Sciences Po, François Godemont, he described the Chinese system as a system of check without balance. So yeah, so indeed, on the one hand, we can see impose many new regulations, but on the other hand, it seems that we have more and more difficulty to keep this power under check. So how do you think of the prospect of achieving the goal of serving the interests of society, given this recent trend and recent evolution? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor Stiglitz, and for your book. It was a lovely, thought-provoking read. I'm very interested in the relationship between neoliberalism and national populism, which is, by all accounts, a revolt against neoliberalism itself. You discuss in your book, and it's elaborated more in a 2018 book by scholars Goodwin and Eatwell, that voters for national populism reject or are revolting against the relative deprivation and the widening economic inequality gap that we see under neoliberalism. So I was wondering how neoliberalism has been able to co-opt this national populist movement that is in itself a rejection of neoliberalism. How are people who are revolting against this system voted in Donald Trump for office?
Yeah. So let me begin by observing that Donald Trump is not neoliberal. And there's been a lot of commentary recently about that. You know, neoliberalism was minimizing government intervention in the market. You couldn't have more government intervention than his attempt to say, I'm going to use trade policy to rejuvenate manufacturing. I'm going to take 10% of the shares of Intel. I'm going, you know, I'll give you, I'll allow you to sell NVIDIA, I'll allow you to sell chips to China, but you have to give me 15% of the revenues. I mean, this is massive government intervention of the kind that no Democrat would even contemplate. I mean, this would be viewed, if a Democrat said this, you would be called a socialist. Now, Trump is not a socialist, but it is a massive, it's National Socialist. Yeah, it's what Nazis did. So it is a massive intervention in market processes, and you can go on a long list of interventions of the kind. So, and let me, so what Trump gave rise to is this disaffection, and that disaffection gave rise to nationalism. And of course, in many ways, nationalism is the antithesis of neoliberal, which was a global free market, trade liberalization, financial market liberalization. So it's an irony that neoliberalism gave rise to its antithesis, but in the Republican Party. And you know, I can tell you, you know, at Columbia Business School, there are a number of Republicans, not a surprise. Most of them feel absolutely rootless because, you know, this is not their Republican Party. They feel that this is a betrayal. You know, they will say, yes, we had to reform the way we did neoliberalism, but what is going on now is the antithesis of everything that they've stood for their whole life. So they're feeling very uncomfortable. But that's a New York Republican. And that's not necessarily the way it's viewed in much of the rest of the country. On the question of China, I've had a lot of discussions in China about the nature of the checks and balances. One aspect of that is at one time earlier, this was 15 years ago, they said, you have your system of checks and balances, we have our system of checks and balances, and they argued that the party was their system, was part of their systems of checks and balances. You had a government, you had the party, and the party would make sure that the government behaved well, and the government would make sure the party behaved well. There were multiple power centers. I obviously was not so confident that organizational form was going to be sustainable. And what happened was, of course, that President Xi appointed basically 6 out of the 7 members of the Politburo to be of his, to be in his faction, in his framework. So it broke down. And what that tells you, you know, the sad thing is you have a breakdown in the system of checks and balances in China at the same time that you have a breakdown in the system of checks and balances in the United States. And that goes back to one of the issues that we began our discussion with. How do you create sustainable systems of checks and balances? There's so much desire to break it down. I mean, the reason you have it is because people with power want to use their power, and you want to stop them. And there's an agglomeration of power and natural forces. And how do you do that? So I think for those of you in terms of research topics and you know, saving the world, I think solving this problem is really one of the most important issues of how do we get more robust systems of checks and balances. One of the interesting aspects of Chinese policies in earlier years was that even though they didn't have the normal forms of democratic accountability, they did a lot of consultation. And I don't know if you know, every 5 years they have a plan that says what are the directions that they're going to go over the next 5 years. And in earlier incarnations of that plan, it always struck me as how many people would tell me they had put that particular or this particular provision into the plan. So there was widespread view that they had been consulted and listened to. And that the plan, you know, the process succeeded in getting their ideas in and making them feel listened to. So it wasn't listening through going to the ballot once every 4 years, which, you know, Putin goes to the ballot once every 4 years and becomes does what he wants in the intervening time. But it was a more consultative process. You asked the question, is China going in the right or the wrong direction? I think it worries me about the concentration of power, the weakening of the systems of checks and balances, the less listening than there used to be. And what that means, of course, is when you face really difficult problems, you sometimes get it wrong. And when you listen to more people, you have a self-correction mechanism. You know, you may not, and the COVID-19 policy obviously was problematic. The way they've managed the real estate collapse has been problematic. The way they attack the tech companies is problematic. There have been a number of things that have raised questions. On the other hand, right now, the sense of optimism is very high because of DeepSeek. Their advances in computerization, in robotization have just been phenomenal. And the United States has united the rest of the world against the United States, and so we've given China a big gift. And China is doing an active role of recruiting Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, to go back to China with really strong incentives. The question, I've saved the last question, the hardest question, which is how do you win the intellectual debate? You know, obviously, I disagree with Milton Friedman and Hayek, but their ideas, even though they're discredited at both, I would say, discredited at an intellectual level in terms of intellectual coherence. I've mentioned, the theorems that are underlying aren't there. The link between the efficiency of the economy, that they are not there. Performance, not there. So now one of the things so why have they been so successful, and how is it that I think we may be more successful going forward? Well, I think they've been partly successful. The ideas are very simple. That's one reason. The invisible hand has a kind of attractiveness to it, pursuit of self-interest. You can understand it. But the interesting thing is Adam Smith didn't believe in the invisible hand. If you read The Wealth of Nations, you see that he didn't believe it. He understood why markets on their own couldn't be relied on. You needed government regulation. You needed government provision of education. So he had a much more holistic view. But some of the Chicago disciples tried to simplify it, and those ideas are simple and persuasive. So that was one of the reasons, the simplicity of those ideas. And second reason is it's in other people, it's in the interest of those who were making a lot of money. The idea of just desserts make people feel good about themselves when you're making a lot of money. The fact that you're acting like a monopolist, you ignore that. You like these kinds of economic theories that justify low regulation, that say you deserve all the money that you have. Why wouldn't you? And so you pay people to tell you that. They become the court jester. And so there are a lot of people, you get paid a lot more money telling Wall Street that it's doing a great job and that they deserve their $5 million, $10 million paycheck than you do if you tell them that they brought on the financial collapse and that they don't deserve what they're getting. So the system it has a perversity in terms of the ideas that persist. The final, what gives me a little bit of optimism, is that neoliberalism has been such a failure that people are beginning to realize something's wrong. Now the problem is, and I talked about this in the book, recognizing that it's a failure doesn't tell you what the answer is. You can say it's a failure and go to Trump nationalism, which is what US has done. And I'm afraid some countries in Europe are going to go in that same direction, rather than go in the progressive direction. So while neoliberalism, I think we're going to move beyond neoliberalism, I'm not sure we're going to move in the right direction after neoliberalism. What? Okay, two questions, very briefly. I'll try to be brief.
Ask the questions and we'll end there.
Okay, perfect. I'll be brief. My name is Abe. Thank you for being here. My question sort of links into what you said at the end, and it's about your view of maybe the current economic agenda of the EU. If you go to Brussels nowadays, I think the talk of the town is competitiveness, 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 and it's all about cutting red tape, cutting taxes, scaling back our green ambitions. And I think the argument often goes, we don't grow at the moment. If we don't grow, we can't pay for our social model. So in a way, they perhaps seem to be in agreement with you that we need a social welfare state, but the way to get there is maybe sort of more neoliberal free market policies. And I was just curious to see how you would respond to those EU officials making that argument.
And very similarly, my question, thank you very much for your time, by the way. My question was about trade-offs, which I found very interesting in your talk. And how can politicians and leaders talk in the language of trade-offs when it's so much more seductive for the populace to say, here is a really easy answer to why your wages haven't increased over 65 years, for example, how can they introduce that into a debate without getting railroaded? Thank you.
I couldn't hear that.
Me neither.
Something,
Yeah.
we couldn't hear you up
Yeah,
here.
both of us.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It was about trade-offs
Trade.
and how can leaders and political leaders talk in the language of trade-offs, if you think that that's what they should do, without getting railroaded by the populists who have an easy answer to why your income may not have risen in the last 65 years, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and that it's part of the broader problem that it's obviously easier to talk in terms of absolutes, to oversimplify, which is what the right, in my mind, often typically does. But you don't have to use the economist jargon of trade-offs. What you can do is talk about what the trade-offs actually are. That is to say, you know, do we want to have more people dying from AK-47? And those issues, most people will say no. And except we have a very strong gun lobby in the United States, and just trying to expose it is a gun lobby, so the things that, the trade-offs that I talked about were not trade-offs. I mean, that is to say, for most people, one could make the argument and they would say, yes, it's obvious that you want vaccinations, it's obvious you don't want children to die of measles, you don't want children to have polio. So I think that in many cases, and the ones that are going to be most politically salient, the answers are pretty clear. So, well, we need to talk about it that way. And when you come to law and you're trying to decide the hardest cases, what kinds of contracts should be allowed, you need to have that kind of discourse. But in general, I don't think, I think you can avoid it. On the other question on the EU and the growth regulation agenda, I think, let me make a couple preliminary statements. First, I think in Europe there is more pessimism about Europe than is deserved. That is to say, a lot of Europeans look at the big success of our GAFA, our tech giants, look at the market value. We don't have anything of that market value. Isn't that a demonstration that Europe isn't functioning well? Well, first of all, the fact that these companies have such a high market value is proof that our framework isn't working. Because in a competitive market, profits get bid away. And if you have profits bid away, you don't have trillion-dollar companies. The existence of these multi-trillion-dollar companies is evidence that we don't have a competitive market. And it creates enormous amount of inequality, and over the long run, I think will dampen innovation in the United States. And you see it very clearly in Silicon Valley. What young people in Silicon Valley, their aspiration is not to have a good innovation that will make a big difference. Their aspiration is to have an innovation that Google will buy up, and they'll become rich. So that, and can you imagine an innovation ecosystem? The main object for 10 years was to build a better advertising engine. Is building a better advertising engine the most socially important problem facing the global economy today? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. I mean, obviously, there are so many more important issues than getting a better advertising engine. So we succeeded, and as a byproduct that, we got advances in AI. So I don't want to downplay it, but that was not what they were trying to do. And many of the researchers who were critical, most of them were not Americans. Many of them were from Europe, many of them from China and India. but relatively small fraction with Europe. We're Americans next because we don't have a great education. I mean, a great. Our universities attract the best people from all over the world, and that was our strength, which now Trump has been trying to destroy. I think the Draghi report puts too much emphasis on finance and not enough emphasis on real R&D and creating an innovation culture. And there are parts, you know, in Europe where there's just a very strong innovation culture. Now, what seems to be right from a lot of people talking to is many startup firms have difficulty scaling up in the United States, and they get bought. But that's partly because we've had such a conglomeration of wealth in the United States, which gives them unfair advantage in that particular domain. But the governments could be taking a more active role in sustaining innovation. So this goes back to what I said. You have to live within your resource constraints, but a pro-growth strategy which focuses not on financial markets, but on real research is, I think, more likely to succeed, and one that has excessive austerity is more likely to fail.
Great, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Stiglitz